this long and painful period of no results is finally over. Some of you may know, October was a bit of a heavy month when it came to official events in Japan. Most tournaments were suspended due to COVID regulations, but now that most of Japan is returning to very low COVID cases as well as vaccination rates being really high, events have finally returned and it's great to have them back. Today, myself, Microphone Fight, will be discussing all of the events that happened over the last weekend that were single player events. These were mostly some of the big competitive events that had a lot on the line in terms of league points, as well as in the case of the DoraVan Championship exclusive winner cards. And so we're going to go through all of the results and data from those events and then talk about all of those events in a vacuum. And after that, we're going to take a look at some of the team event results that we've had over the last couple of weeks and just talk about various interesting decks that have popped up from all of those events. Before we get into the video, I'd like to also ask you guys to like the video if you do like it and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I also have various other socials. I stream on Twitch, I'm on Twitter, etc, etc. So make sure you check out everything in the description below. So first off, we're going to actually take a look at the DoraVan tournament. So this was a tournament that was organized by the card shop chain Dragonstar, and this was held between 3 different cities of the Kansai region. So this was Kyoto, Osaka, and Kobe, and they're even called Keihanshin, which is basically Kyoto, Osaka, and Kobe. And so basically these tournaments were held at the same time, and then the winners of them played against each other in order to decide who would be the winner of them all. And I believe that the one from Osaka had a bit of an extra weight, and therefore they were put straight into the finals, while the winners from Kyoto and Kobe had to fight between each other. But each specific qualifier also had its own, of course, tournament, and we had some very interesting winners from all of them. We're going to start off with the Kyoto tournament, where we have the top 4 data. So in first place, we had a Bruce, which was quite interesting to see. This is a pretty different Bruce from what we're used to seeing, actually. This is a list that used the grade 1 Quenlu, which is an interesting card that puts itself to soul to give a regard plus 2k, and as long as you have 7 or more soul, it gives that unit grade 1 or higher guard restrict, meaning that that attack cannot be perfect guarded. We've seen lists that use this card with Eden for the extra critical swing, but here we see it chucked into just this typical Bruce list, which is very interesting to see. The trigger lineup is also quite aggressive. We typically see quite a lot of draws in most Bruce lists, but this one is going for those high criticals and just trying to shut out the game with that guard restrict. In second place, there was also another Bruce. This one is a lot more conventional, as we would expect, running the typical lineup of the grade 3s, grade 2s with 3 Derricks. You have your fair share of Protobulbs as well as the Dober, but the trigger lineup here remains to be quite aggressive as well, with a choice of 7 criticals and 4 fronts. In third place, we had Lornerol, which is quite the tried and tested build here as well. We see the usual order lineup. There's 4 of the fall one, we see that at 3 sometimes as well, and choosing to run the grade 2 that gets plus 5k power over the grade 1, thus prioritizing to have more attackers. And in fourth place, we have another Lornerol list. This one is running the grade 1 with 3k power, as well as the grade 2 Virginia that basically gives you a choice of getting more soul and countercharge. So slightly different Lornerol lists, but we can see here that these are basically some of the top 2, strongest decks of the current meta, which are Lornerol and Bruce. Looking at the Kobe tournament, however, we see some completely different results, as first place is probably one of my favorite decks from this new set, which is of course the Ragreal Bastion. Now I have a video on Ragreal Bastion coming up pretty soon. I think those of you that liked the Hyper Librarian of Arena video will like that one quite a lot. But Ragreal initially was quite a slept on card and people thought it wasn't even that great, but it ended up being the new backbone of the deck, basically taking the deck to new heights. So much so that some of the top Japanese players even wrote an entire guide on how to use this card and how to use this new age of Bastion. The general flex spots in this deck are usually where you see the form up Chosen Knights, so that's the choice for this deck list. Some people play cards like Dark Strain, some people play the Order, some people play Ease Rod. There's many different ways to actually structure this deck. The only real staples are basically Refair Sauce, Alden, Ragreal, and the grade 1 countercharger as well. So I'm very happy to see this deck coming out on top and not just taking first place, but also coming second with a pretty different list that you see here. So it's still running 4 of the Ragreal, but here we still see the Dark Strains as well as Cocobeals. So choosing to not go all in on the offense that this deck is really good at, and choosing to still have a stronger turn 3 as well as defensive plays with Cocobeel, and then choosing to use the Ragreal as the finisher, which I think is also a valid option for this deck. This list is also choosing to use draw triggers, which is the more kind of like conventional choice choice for this deck. We saw the first list actually go full on the criticals, but I think that when you use Ragreal, you generally want to have draws just as easy discard targets. In third place, we actually had another Bruce player here, only running 1 Derek and a total of 7 draws, so this one is a lot less explosive and aggressive as we were seeing so far, choosing to instead go for just the tried and tested combo game plan, even using the Blitz order for more defensive plays as well, although I do wonder how much the Derek actually came up being run at only 1 copy. This player is also Riku. We can see, I believe he was one of the VMC participants, as you can see by that beautiful Messiah playmat. And finally, in fourth place, we had Seraph Snow, and this Seraph Snow list is quite interesting. It's running a couple of the new cards that we've seen not that much of in the modern Seraph Snow lists. Of course, the promo that we haven't gotten yet in English is a 4 of as always, but we see the Execute Lemon, who essentially is able to imprison 3 units at a time while also gaining a bunch of power and an extra critical, which is pretty strong, I guess, when you're going for a finisher. And then also running the Bougainvillea, which is an interesting card that lets you basically reposition one of your opponent's units through the prison, which we haven't really seen too much of in these prison deck lists, but making it to top 4 with a list like this definitely means that there is something to look out for in here. And then finally we had the Osaka tournament, which was held in Nipponbashi, and we saw here that the first place was Kiria with Bruce, a much more defensive option again here, this time running 7 draws again with 4 fronts and 4 heals, no critical triggers whatsoever, going with 4 Derricks this time around for more of the explosive power. There's no Dobers, just 4 Protobulbs as the only grade 1s in the deck, together with the Perfect Guards and 3 of the Blitz order for more defensive power. These Bruce lists, like, while it may seem like Bruce is topping a lot, every single Bruce list has been different, and the game plan does change quite a lot depending on how you structure this deck, so I'm very interested to see if we can maybe see some gameplay of these decks as well. In second place, we also had another Bruce player, this time around playing the, I want to say, conventional list for Bruce, as we see the Dobers, the Protobulbs, the Marjories, Lenards, Derricks, etc., and also going for a pretty high critical count, not using the Rainbow lineup that we've been seeing quite a lot so far. In third place, however, we saw Zorga. Now, this is a deck that we've definitely been seeing quite a lot of in the West from a lot of the remote tournaments in general, just like online presence for competitive play of the Japanese format. Zorga is a very strong powerhouse when it comes to set 3, simply because of the new triple rare grade 2 that lets you easily search for your orders, thus letting you play lesser copies of certain ones that you can just tech for. And we also see here an importance of the grade 3 there that you see on the bottom right that gains plus 5k power on both players' turns on rearguard circle for every order card in your bind zone. So this is definitely very exciting to see, Zorga just coming out on top. The order lineup is also quite varied, and we've seen many different takes on Zorga throughout the West as well as Japan, so I can't wait to see how this deck is going to evolve going forward. And finally, in fourth place, we had another Lorna Royal list looking quite similar to the one from the other DoraVan that we took a look at, but this time running 7 draws, which is actually a pretty high lineup of draws for a deck like this that initially wanted to run as many criticals as possible before criticals were restricted to 8. And the one that took it all from the 3 regions was actually Kiria with the Bruce list that we took a look at earlier. So that's it for that event. The other event that happened a week ago was the Ikkyu-san CS. So Ikkyu-san is actually a card shop that holds a large-scale event for Vanguard every so often, and here we saw quite a lot of Lorna Roll in the top cut. First place was Lorna Roll that you can see over here. Second place was Lorna Roll as well, with 3 of the LSRs, not to mention. Fourth place was also Lorna Roll, running that pure kind of like bread and butter deck list for this deck. But third place was a Nirvana, which is one of the few Nirvanas we've been seeing topping here and there, running a very aggressive trigger lineup of 8 crit, 3 front, 3 of the base Varinas in addition to the Elgars as well as Arcs, and only 1 of each Valiente and Expecta, which is very interesting to see how this deck has been evolving over time, and the counts of the different Varinas have been changing so much. The one thing that we see in a lot of these Japanese lists is the 4 of Himena, where players kind of like, they don't care so much about the CB of Valiente or the CB of Expecta, but really want to put their counterblast into cards like Arcs and cards like the Himena that actually get them the plus that they want. And generally speaking, the best Varinas are still Arcs and Urger, so we're really gonna have to see how Esperal Idea changes things. Ikkyu-san also had a sub-tournament, so a lot of these big events oftentimes, after a few rounds have passed or after top cut has started, they do a sub-tournament for the players that didn't make it to top cut, and here we saw a Verina actually come out first, again seeing a very low grade 3 Verina count over here, but the usual 2 of Togachirashi, 4 Himena, and 4 of the grade 2 Verinas, even 4 of the base one as well. But in second place we saw Gravidia Nordlinger, which was a pretty nice list, basically running the maximum amount of meteors with the 3 of the ride line grade 1 in addition, because that lets you set more of the orders and also just function as a good attacker, and 4 of the 15k attacker slash 10k shield double rare that is basically the best attacker that the deck has. Gravidia is definitely a very interesting deck. I didn't think of it too much when it was revealed, but after having played it, it's honestly a lot more fun, and like managing your resources with the meteors is actually very fun, and I can't wait to see how the deck's going to get support in the future. Also, forgot to mention, there's only 3 heal triggers in this deck, which is pretty interesting, so really going all out on the aggression that this deck can have. There's a few other decks in the top 8 of this event, so we saw of course the 3 Lorna rolls and 1 Nirvana. The other tops were 1 more Lorna roll, 1 more Nirvana, 1 Bruce, and 1 Barrow Magnus that unfortunately we do not have the list for. Moving forward, we have the BVFL, so this is of course the large-scale event that we've been talking about throughout the year, and this is actually the last month of the BVFL, and I believe that it's even the next one is going to be streamed on the Gamers Dogma channel this upcoming weekend, so you guys can check that out if you want to see some live competitive play. There were 2 events, one was in Kawasaki, the other one was in Honatsugi, and we had some pretty different results for these, and they also had tournaments for different formats. Now this video I'm going to focus on standard, but I'll be doing another video talking about some of the results this week for V Premium as well as Premium, and especially for V Premium there's been a lot of WGP qualifiers that we can definitely look at the results of as well, so please do look forward to that. Starting out, we had the Honatsugi one first, and here was a very interesting top 8. First place was taken by Ragreal Bastion, which is the player was Ogasawara. He's quite well known on Twitter as well, so it was really nice to see him go undefeated all the way into first place. Second place was Bruce. Third and fourth were both Nirvana lists, and then top 8 was 2 Bruces, 1 Greedon, and 1 Lorna roll. Taking a look at the first place Bastion list, this one's a pretty typical approach to the deck as well, basically just running Form of Chosen Knights as the sort of tech spot and playing 3 draw triggers, which we see quite frequently as well, in order just to make up the discard cost for Ragreal a little bit less painful, which again varies quite a lot depending on the game state, because as a lot of players that have read the different guides and content around this deck know that you generally rest 2, 4, or 0 units depending on what the game state actually is. I really love Ragreal Bastion, like this generally might become my main deck once we get to set 3. The second place Bruce list is a pretty typical take on the list. I think we've seen something similar like this before. This time going on the full rainbow trigger lineup, which I do agree with quite a lot, and I do like myself a lot too. Running 3 of the 20k power blitz order, which I think is really nice to see that defensive play come in now of all times as well. 4 Derricks as well, with none of the Dobers. Looking at the first of the top 4 lists, we see here none of the grade 3 Verinas being played, with an 8 crit 3 draw lineup, 4 Himena, 3 Togashirashi, and just maxing out on the grade 2 Verinas in order to have essentially just as much ability to bash down early as possible, and also just having like as much plussing power that can be refunded by the Urger as possible. The other top 4 Nirvana list actually ran 2 of the Expectas and only 2 of the base Nirvanas, and this list looks basically identical to my own actually, with a very aggressive trigger lineup, choosing to play 3 Togashirashi and 2 of the base Nirvana, and the 2 Expecta that can be just annoying body on the board, but there is a lot of removal in the current format, which of course makes it for these Soul Verinas quite difficult to deal with. The top 8 Bruce lists, this one was actually quite interesting. It actually ran 2 of the Regina that I think a lot of people on reveal thought was quite strong, in being able to essentially filter 2 of your rear guards into another rear guard that gets more power, so thus being able to throw away like your draw triggers and general like meh cards out of your hand, turning them into something better, or just like tutoring something out of your soul. So seeing her come in is actually quite nice, but the deck is very counterblast heavy when you do choose to play her, because then you're counterblasting for the order, counterblasting for her, counterblasting for Derek, and so all of that adds up really quickly, plus the Proto Bulb, and so that's a big reason why she hasn't been played as much, but this is definitely an example of how you can build a deck with her involved. The other Bruce list was another one of these Quenlu decks, which is the God Restrict grade 1. Here we see Leonard actually at 3 and choosing to play 4 of the Edens, so this is one of the lists that definitely is going harder on that game plan. 8 crate 3 front, and even playing the Pandemonium tactics to make sure that you have a big soul to get the most amount of power going. Up next we actually had a Greedon top here, which is one of the very few Greedons that I've topped, and of course this deck is actually quite strong right out of the first set of support that it got. Greedon itself pushing you to 7 damage and having that very powerful restand ability. The grade 2 of the ride line gives you extra power, grade 1 of the ride line being basically used as a bonus draw, the Inkin basically being used as a CB2 get extra drive. Both of the grade 3s have some form of use here as well, where 1 is basically a very powerful grade 3 attacker that can remain on the board even after you eat everything for Greedon's ability. Time Durate Dragon is basically used as a soul filler slash filter that you can then put into the soul for Greedon's ability as well, and this one's actually using the Ig Speller as well, which is like, of course, a great card for Greedon, being able to counterblast 1, put into the drop from the soul to soul charge 1, and give you Vanguard plus 10k to make that restanding Greedon even more threatening. And this list isn't even playing fronts, just going for 3 draw 8 crit, which is quite interesting. I feel like sometimes there's a risk of the deck decking out, but because the soul last cost isn't that high and you're mostly just like filling up your soul with things that make your Vanguard more powerful, I guess it isn't as much of a threat. And finally, we have another top 8 Lorna roll list that we're quite used to seeing at this point as well. Interesting, splitting the grade 1s and 2s that get plus 5k power here, which we don't see that often. Most players just choose one and stick with it, but this one chose to actually differentiate that. In terms of deck usage as well, we have 45 players that participate in this event, Lorna roll being used by 24% of them, 16% used Bastion, Nirvana being used by 13%, Bruce by 11%, and then all other decks were used by 3 people or less. So it's quite interesting to see how Bastion was actually the second most used deck, but only one of them managed to come out on top. Lorna roll as well was used by the most amount of people, but only one of them made it out on top as well. And this is where we already saw a couple of the Shaman King decks pop up in the participation rates, but sadly no tops just yet. If you want more details on the event, such as the win rates of the decks, as well as the different matchups and how those converted overall throughout the tournament, please do make sure to check out the link in the description for this event. Up next, we had the BVFL Kawasaki, which was on November 7th. So here was another very interesting top 8, where first place, D-Stun guy, so D-Stun is of course D-Standard, so D-Standard guy, won with Seraph Snow, and second place was also Seraph Snow. Third place was Bruce, as well as fourth being Lorna roll. And then the rest of the top 8 was again Bruce, Lorna roll, Clarissa, as well as Asakura Yo, so that was Shaman King. So most of the Bruce and Lorna roll lists that came out on this event are pretty much similar to what we looked at, except for the one that was in top 8, which was quite interesting. So I want to showcase this one, which runs the Quenlu, but also had an interesting choice of running the Brian. So this is a card that says Soul Blast 2 once per turn Reguard Circle, for that turn to give your front row units plus 5k, and if you're in Final Rush, your Vanguard gets an extra critical. So if you have 2 of these on the board, you get a plus 10k to your front row, which is basically Persona Ride, and on top of that you give plus 2 crit to your Vanguard, which is pretty great. And if you run Pandemonium Tactics, you get to Soul Charge even more consistently and reach that Soul Blast requirement for this card as well. It doesn't even run Lennar. There's basically like a Quenlu dedicated deck with 4 Reginas, 4 Dereks, and 3 Edens. So I really like this alternative take to Bruce, and this is like what I mean, how these Bruce decks are so different from one another and have completely different game plans, and I think that exploring this different approach to the same deck is what makes this format really exciting. Taking a look at the top 2 decks though, we of course have Seraph Snow in first. This is basically kind of like your deck out Seraph Snow type build, running the new grade 2 that basically lets your opponent choose a card from their hand, put it into the prison, and then draw a card. So you basically force them to draw more, and by calling down 4 of those, that's 4 extra cards to get out of your opponent's deck. And as prison can play the long game pretty well, this can actually be a very viable win con for the Seraph Snow deck overall. Second place was quite different, very similar to what we saw in the other region actually, running 2 of the Limon as well as 2 of the Mill grade 2, but still we see like this usual staples of X amount of Bug Motor, X amount of Cheval Stud, then usually 4 of the Perio Turquoise, 4 of the Gara Rouge, and of course 4 of the grade 2 promo. Clarissa got a top here as well, and this is kind of like your typical Clarissa list. I actually won my shop league with this exact list just yesterday as well, running 4 of all of the Earnest Corrects and then 3 of the Blitz Order that gives plus 30k power because it's a very, very strong Blitz Order, and then 8 crit 3 front because you're gonna deck out otherwise. It's a strong deck, but at the same time it is quite easy to counterplay it, and you do have to draw into all of your pieces, otherwise you do brick and don't do much. And if you only have like one order to play with, then you really have to be careful about how you actually commit your board, especially against some matchups like Bruce. And finally, the big surprise for me was that Asakura Yo, the Shaman King deck, actually made it out on top here. So Asakura Yo works pretty interestingly. The ride line basically searches out the grade 1, and then the grade 3 of course oversouls it by putting the grade 3 into the soul. The grade 2 actually, when boosted by it, lets you draw an extra card, so you get some early card draw. Then you have the grade 2 Asakura Yo that basically gets plus 2k for every damage you have, and when it would be hit by an attack, you can Soul Blast 1 to make it not be hit. You have the Anna that basically restands your Vanguard when it doesn't hit, so it's kind of like a Dragonic Descendant, which is definitely quite nice. The grade 2 John lets you Soul Blast 3 to draw 1 and countercharge 1, which refunds your resources. The grade 2 that you see here also is a 15k shield, which is very strong. And so generally speaking, you have a bunch of salvage. You have like countercharge, shield power, Vanguard restand, pressure on rearguard circles. The grade 1 that you oversoul with can also get crit on rear, while Ascarayo on the Vanguard circle can also gain crit on Vanguard circle. So it's actually a pretty strong deck. Like, I looked into how this deck plays and it looks quite strong. So I wouldn't be too surprised if Shaman King does find itself at the top of the leaderboards throughout upcoming events as well. So that is it for the single player events. And so I have made this beautiful graphic thanks to our graphics designer Belladonna Tuxin, representing all of the single player tops over this last weekend. So you can see that overall the meta is looking to be heavily dominated by Bruce and Lorna, where these decks are just kind of like your go-tos. The very important thing here is that, like, within Bruce, we could break this down into like 3 or 4 different decks, right? We've seen so many different approaches to the deck, and this definitely changes quite a lot. So that huge slice that Bruce is taking up can definitely be broken down into various different builds. It's Lorna actually that is basically the same deck every single time. So that is one deck that just right out the package is really strong. Nirvana, of course, came out on top quite a few times, basically just relying on the stronger search power thanks to Himena now, and being able to use the good old tool that the deck has. Ragreal Bastion has been topping here and there, and is still a very strong foe to deal with. Seraph Snow has been coming out on top a fair bit as well. And then we have our one-ofs of Ascarayo, Greedon, Clarissa, Zorga, and Barrow Magnus that sadly we don't have a deck list for. So that is essentially what the meta looks like right now for the D-BT03 format. Of course, this will still change and evolve, and I think as we keep getting more big events, I think I'll keep making videos like this talking about the various developments. I wanted to quickly take a moment to show some of the other deck lists that have shown up in the various team tournaments. So there was the Aburage Vanguard Exchange event, which was a team tournament, and in the 3rd place team we saw this Barrow Magnus list that basically went 4-2 in the general tournament, but their team managed to place 3rd. So it's quite interesting to see how this is now playing Pandemonium Tactics, 3 of the Ashurda, 2 of the Recycler that we saw before as well, and a pretty damn aggressive trigger lineup as well. We then had a Gravidia list that actually went 5-1 in the team tournament, also came 3rd. Seems like the carry of this team actually. Running more normal units in the deck actually, choosing to play more of the Ride Line grade 2 that basically lets you draw extra cards if you have more soul, which is perfectly valid in the current case of the deck, simply because you need more attackers sometimes, because if your opponent just trades them away or retires them, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. And the 1st place team had a very interesting Ragreal list as well. This one running one of the Lepisto, which can actually have a very deadly combo with Ragreal, where if you have 2 of the countercharge in grade 1, you can attack with the Lepisto first, attack with Ragreal, counterblast 2 to gain the ability to drive check, then drive check a trigger, use both of the countercharges to soul blast and countercharge the 2 cards you have in your damage zone, and then use that to, in the same timing, restand the Lepisto, which is a pretty interesting play, and I personally kind of want to also play one Lepisto just for the possibility of that play. So I just wanted to feature this one. This is from the 1st place team. This one went X1, only losing in the 1st round of the tournament, so I think it's definitely worth to take a look at this list as well. And finally here, I won't be showing any deck lists, you can find them in the description instead, but for my own sub-tournament, we actually had a full house for the FRF standard last month. In this one, you use a D-BT03 format because it was meant to be BRO practice. And as you can see, the top 8 was quite interesting. Of course, we had your little bit of Lorna roll, but none of the Bruces made it to top cut. Sadly, there was no Bastion players in the tournament, but we had 3 whole Zorgas, 1 Magnolia, 1 Orphist, and 1 Gravidia Nordlinger there as well. I'll leave the link in the description if you want to take a look at the deck list, as I share them on the Twitter every single time after the tournament. And that is basically it for today's meta analysis of the D-BT03 format. It's overall shaping up to be a very interesting format. Even though we're seeing a lot of Lorna roll and different kinds of Bruces come out on top, there's a lot of other lists that are popping up here and there, and the meta definitely doesn't feel solved just yet, especially with how different these Bruce lists are. On a local level, we've also been seeing a lot of Bav Sagara come out on top, so there's a chance that maybe that is a legit deck to expect even without all of its support in set 4. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how the meta will evolve and what kind of results we're going to see over the coming weeks. As I said it earlier, I'll also have another video similar to this one talking about the V Premium result of recent. As long as it's been so long since we've had these like big tournament results, so I really wanted to sit down and talk about everything. But anyway, that's gonna be it for me today. If you guys liked the video, please do give it a like, and if you haven't already, please do subscribe as well. But on that note, that's it for me today, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.